Ahoy! The Season 2 Blood in the Sands patch notes are out and they're absolutely insane. There's a ton to cover. I will do that in two videos. This is one part. This is where I will be talking about all the weapons. And then there's another part where we'll be talking about the weapon unrelated changes. And since we're talking about weapons first, we're going to begin with one of my personal favorites. Sword and Shield is getting a massive amount of changes. First of all, there's a little fix to Leaping Strike, sometimes going on cooldown when it shouldn't. And Coral Lash, a named weapon that has a keen and refreshing move, will now actually get a third perk, Transient Strikes. So not going to be a bad starter weapon, not the best, but at least decent. And then there are also a handful of shields that are getting fixed. One of those, for example, is probably the one from Ennead, which was labeled as a tower shield, but was actually a kite shield. So that is kind of being twisted around a bit, so it should actually be functioning as expected now. But now the really important part, the abilities. We're starting with Whirling Blade. Whirling Blade has been sped up in its attack itself, which is already a very important factor, because at the moment the attack and especially the wind down afterwards are incredibly slow. Of course, we don't know how quickly it will happen now yet, so we'll have to see how good that is, but that's not the only change. The damage is increased from 145 to 160%, and the hitbox size is increased. Also, there is additional time to redirect the attack during the startup. Currently, it kind of locks you in the direction immediately, so it's going to be much smoother. It's going to be easier to hit enemies with a bigger hitbox, which was always super awkward and super clunky, and it's going to deal more damage when it hits, while the animation is also quicker. So this is probably actually going to be better than light attacking now, hopefully. I will, of course, test that when it comes out. But on top of all of that, it is now also a tank ability, and that's because the opportunity upgrade for this ability is increased from 5% rend to 15%. This means that especially in PvE, it is really worth using now. I expect that this will actually shift around a lot of tank builds, and this will be a staple for many of them. So this is going to be super cool in itself. And this also opens more options for a DPS build with Sword and Shield, which has fallen a bit out of favor over time. And we're also getting more changes along with that would help that a little bit more as well. Reverse Step also gets a slightly sped up attack animation. Along with that, the homing has been adjusted to account for the updated speed, and the hitbox size has also been slightly increased. On top of all that, there's also additional time to redirect the attack during the startup. This means it's going to be a lot harder to get away from Reverse Stab, whereas currently you're kind of locked in the direction as well, similar to Whirling Blade. So you usually use it in combo with a Shield Bash, whereas now it sounds like you should be able to reasonably freehand it a lot more often. There's also another change that comes in a second that will help with that too. Defiant Stance gets an additional functionality to reduce the attacker's stamina damage by 20% while active. This is huge because there are very few defensive perks that actually affect stamina damage directly while using them, so this is going to make tanking a fair bit easier with Sword and Shield, even though it was not particularly hard most of the time to begin with. But it's like this effect because it rewards Defiant Stance more. On top of that, the buff is also applied earlier in the animation, and the recovery of the attack is reduced, so it should be a lot easier to just quickly switch out of block into Defiant Stance and pull your block back up, whereas currently you often get punished during that animation a lot. So great changes to Defiant Stance here, making that a smoother ability and a bit more on level with some of the newer taunts as well. The AoE of Defensive Formation is also increased from 3 to 4 meters. This is especially important because this is one of the few damage absorption perks or direct mitigation perks that are still available to players, whereas most of the Fortifies are now scaling on armor, and this one is not. So this should have a decent amount of effectiveness, even in PvP situations. It's been used quite a while there, but with this bigger radius, it's going to be even more effective. This last one is extra spicy. Shield Rush reduced the recovery of the extra animation that is played with the upgrade by 7 frames. So you may be aware of this combo, which is Shield Rush into Shield Bash, and that is one that didn't really work if you had the upgrade that applies a weaken upon use of this ability. This is because this weaken would add this post animation, which would make it so that you would no longer be able to have a true combo from Shield Rush to Shield Bash. So if you wanted to use that combo build, you basically had to decide between these options. And obviously also it made any other follow-up more annoying as well. Now it sounds like with these 7 frames it should be possible to make that a true combo, though it's not guaranteed. Again, have to test it first. But also it means that the ability in itself is a little less annoying to use because it doesn't hold you in place as much. The real question is if you want to even use the Shield Rush, Shield Bash combo in the first place. It's fantastic for the weekend still, of course, but maybe with the other ability changes, there may be DPS players that are just going for full left tree now, just going Leaping Strike and Whirling Blade and Reverse Stab because they can be free-handed a lot better now without using the CC of Shield Bash. Or maybe you will just use Shield Rush and use Shield Rush into Reverse Stab if that is possible. There are a lot more options that could be considered, different playstyles that don't revolve as much around Shield Bash, with a lot more other abilities being viable in different ways. And I think that is something that is absolutely fantastic and something that they saw needed for a really long time, because it was always this one-trick weapon that just revolves around Shield Bash in PvP, and that should no longer be the case, and likewise in PvE we have a few extra options here as well now. So I think this is great, I think this is a fantastic overhaul. This is how weapons should be reworked. I don't even know, they didn't label this specifically as a Sword and Shield rework, but I feel like it is almost on the level of the Fire Staff rework. I suppose they didn't really touch the other perks in the trees as much and didn't touch the shield wage still, which is annoying, but still, this is a very big overhaul to many important aspects of Sword and Shield. On the spear, the damage of Cyclone is increased from 130 to 165%, and the attack is sped up. On top of that, the hitbox is extended down a little bit, so it's less likely to miss the ground if someone is, for example, knocked down. I think Cyclone in itself has a variety of usability issues. It's just a very weird ability to use in many situations, and this AoE damage that it has is not really part of the playstyle for most spear users, and it's not what they're using their abilities for, but at the same time 165% scaling as AoE is pretty big along with the other effects it provides. Maybe someone will figure out a build somehow to make this effective, to make this more useful, to make this maybe usable in PvE. I'm not sure yet, but I am excited to see what people are coming up with at this point, because this really is a very significant damage boost. The Void Gauntlet gets a couple of tooltip fixes, and also you can harvest at 0.57 seconds instead of 1 second. And they also mentioned the Void Blade grid on 300 con again, but that was already on the last PTR, so unless that somehow didn't make it onto live, that should already be in the game. But much more importantly, Baleful Tether added functionality to keep the tether active while swapping to secondary. This is extremely good. I cannot overstate just how good this is for the Void Gauntlet. I have always been saying that Baleful Tether is only held back by the fact that you need to swap away from the weapon. Baleful Tether is in quite a few ways stronger than Oblivion if you take away the nullifying part of it, because the nullifying part is what it's used in wars for. In group fight situations, Oblivion will always reign supreme, but in 1v1 scenarios, Baleful Tether is very, very good. It has a 20% empower and a 20% weaken, as well as a 31% slow when used on armor as a perk. So this is a very fight-changing ability. So if you can use this while being another weapon, and especially if the empower lasts on another weapon as well, I'm not sure about that part, it's going to be extremely good. As far as I can tell, this should also stack with Oblivion, so you can really skew the odds in your favor if you can catch someone in an Oblivion and have all this stuff going on. I used to run a very silly debuffer dual build, which was Void Gauntlet and Spear, and seeing how this would work now with Baleful Tether, it would actually be completely ridiculous. There would be so many weakens going around all the time, so many empowers, but even in more logical situations, I think Tether has a lot of effectiveness now. Even if you're switching to something ranged, using a Fire Staff on Ice Gauntlet, just making use of the empower, I think there's a lot of use here, or setting up other abilities with the slow from it. The fact that it is just not limited by being on the Void Gauntlet anymore opens up so much more opportunity for it. The Warhammer also finally gets some love after kind of getting crushed in the CC patch. The Mighty Gavel ability in particular is the one that sees a bit more of an adjustment here. For some reason, the hitbox on that ability will now appear 1 frame sooner. Not exactly sure what the reason behind that is or the logic behind that. I feel like they must have some particular effect in mind with that. Wrecking Ball can no longer double hit by hitting targets outside of the radius if you move your camera quickly. That one is finally fixed after a very long time, but at least it's gone now. And the tooltip for safety measures upgrade for Warhammer's Wrecking Ball ability now states the functionality being a Fortify. Mighty Gavel has a slightly increased impact area, and also the Justice for All upgrade, which previously gave you the follow-up attack with slightly higher damage, or a fair bit higher damage actually, is now working differently. Instead, it now gives you 1 free Mighty Gavel use per cooldown. So effectively you're using the first swing twice now, as far as I understand it, which is much better in the context of you not being locked in place for so long and having to be in that particular position, not getting staggered and all that stuff, because if any of that happens, you would not get the second damage through. This generally makes using Mighty Gavel much safer and more reliable. I don't think that will push the ability into PvP, for example, and there's still the general issue of it not providing any CC or having any grit, but if you're purely in it for the damage, then there is something to look at here. Now there's still a bit of a problem with Mighty Gavel, and that is in the form of the next change, which is Armor Breaker getting a buff. The damage of Armor Breaker is increased from 140 to 160%. Additionally, the power of the Rend from Lasting Trauma is increased from 20% to 30%. And the opening act upgrade now works against targets that are at above 70% health and not just targets that are at full health. So really everything about this is better. And that realistically means that in most situations, the overall damage output of Armor Breaker will probably be better. You can use both, but it takes away a lot of your flexibility, because at that point you're probably using Shockwave as your last ability with Sundering, or you're maybe just using Wrecking Ball with the CC and you're foregoing Sundering Shockwave. But it is just a lot more limiting than the normal Shockwave, Armor Breaker, Wrecking Ball that a lot of people tend to use in PvE for damage. I think it mostly comes down to if you're running more than one Warhammer. If your tank is a Warhammer with Sundering Shockwave and you don't need to apply that yourself, then you can probably opt into more left tree and then you can get away with Mighty Gavel. Rapier's Flurry has been changed though that the damage doesn't scale up with each hit anymore, but it does a consistent amount of damage per hit, and this consistent damage is now 60% damage per stab. In addition to that, the homing is also supposed to be more consistent and line up properly with the attacks. Tondo is getting a change to proper spacing, which is the perk that increases the initial hit damage of Tondo by 100%. Currently, if the target is more than 4 meters away, and now this is going to be against targets with a bleed on them. This is a bit strange. So effectively, this is a PvP nerf if you're using Tondo in PvP, because usually there's the benefit in enemies running away and you hit them with Tondo and it does a little bit more damage. And often you won't have a bleed on them yet unless you used Tondo previously. Simultaneously, in PvE, where you often close them up anyways, I think this will just be a buff in many of those situations, because you often can open with Flurry, apply a bleed from that, and then you can follow up with Tondo and get the extra damage from the hit of that. The Blunderbuss gets a variety of fixes, many of them resulting in the overall damage output being nerfed though. So, for example, Netshot could apply status effects to targets that were riposting and blocking. That's no longer the case. Some Blunderbuss effects were being improperly removed while traversing the world. An issue of the Blunderbuss could grant all stacks of Empowering Breaker in a single shot. The passive Extended Chamber would sometimes grant ammo after shots were fired. And Runeglass Dots and various other on-hit effects would apply from Splitting Grenade, from the impact of Splitting Grenade. Those will now only trigger off of the explosion, so they'll still apply quite often, but you can see there are some tweaks here that will make the Blunderbuss just a little bit less effective. In return, Blast Shot is getting its range increased by 1 meter. I think that's okay. This is not Aethos Shrapnel Blast, this is Blast Shot, the one that knocks you down, and I think that ability is comparatively not a big problem child on the Blunderbuss at all, so I think this change is fine. It's definitely not the Blunderbuss meta that I thought we would be having prior to the patch, because the tweaks reined it in a bit and both are just kind of outclassing it in many ways right now. So I'm okay with the Blunderbuss not seeing major changes in either direction here, and fixing the inconsistencies I think is a good step here. Speaking of the bow, this gets a couple of fixes, nothing too major here. Sometimes you are unable to use a potion or eat food while starting to sprint when using a bow, that's fixed. And Rain of Arrows gets a massive amount of buffs. The bleed damage of the Barbed Arrows upgrade is increased from 7.1 to 15%, and the cooldown is reduced from 25 to 20%. The time it takes for the arrows to be shot into the air to when the attack lands is also reduced, so it just be quicker in general, and the radius is increased from 3 to 4 meters. It is weird to see a bow buff in the current state of the bow, but realistically, Rain of Arrows was never part of the problems of the bow at all, and it's definitely an underwhelming ability, so this is the one that they chose for the rework, so I think that is understandable. I think this could make it more interesting for wars maybe, and at least give it some niche usage that it currently just doesn't have, though I think the bigger problem with it is still the targeter just being weird even after all the fixes that they did to it. So yeah, I haven't used it in a while. I don't know if maybe with the last batch of changes it got improved a bit more, but generally speaking, I can see why a lot of people avoid this in general. But the bow is also getting a pretty significant nerf in form of the dodge and weave passive. The functionality of this will now only trigger at full stamina, meaning you're only getting the haste after dodging for 2 seconds at full stamina. Considering this was previously almost a permanent 10% haste for bows because you could have it up so often and would allow you to run away very easily as well, it is to be a fair bit more tactical now. I think it's still something you can use quite frequently if you use it properly, but especially in situations where the bow is kind of just kiting left and right and dodging a lot, they won't often get this passive anymore if they get engaged on and then try to roll away, because they won't be at full stamina because of their left and right dodging, and then when the enemy attacks them, they try to dodge away, but they don't get the haste at that point. So I think this is definitely a nerf that will affect the bow. How much is hard to say. Much more significant are these next two changes. So things are changing place here, and we're going to start with the second one. Evasive Tactics is now in place of Knee Shot. So Evasive Tactics, which is currently in row 1 of the Skirmisher tree, which provides you with 15% extra damage after dodging for 5 seconds, is now the final ability. This is the last thing you get in the tree. And instead, Knee Shot goes up where Evasive Tactics was before, but is also renamed. It is now Rending Headshot, and now instead of giving you this slow, it applies a 10% rend for 3 seconds on Headshot. I'm not gonna lie, this feels a little bit weird in terms of how it's set up, because effectively I felt like the right tree was designed more for a headshot because the capstone is for headshots, and now they are removing knee shots entirely and turning that into a headshot mechanic as well. But then Evasive Tactics requiring more commitment into left tree will affect a lot of builds, I believe. Many bow builds primarily opt into right tree along with Evade Shot and may have to commit more into the left tree instead now, and there are some points in there that aren't necessarily the greatest, I would say. You also have to choose between the 15% more damage after dodging or the 20% more headshot damage now. You can't have both anymore, and I think that's going to be a significant trade-off for the bow in general. The Fire Staff gets a couple of fixes to how Meteor Shower interacts with other effects, and Flare was not dealing the correct amount of stamina damage to blocking targets. Additionally, the damage of Incinerate is increased from 150 to 175, and the recovery of the attack is reduced. This is understandable because since the rework, I would say this is by far the weakest ability of all of them. It kind of got a lot of it taken away from it in favor of Burnout getting more, so I can see why they're buffing it up a little bit. On the other hand, they are nerfing Pillar of Fire, reducing the damage from 165% to 155%. The Fire Staff nerfs are slightly smaller than I would have expected. I know some people are kind of overrating Fire Staff a little bit at the moment, but I do think that there is still room to change a little bit more. But I think they're just kind of gradually dialing it down and tweaking some other things where needed. Because some people actually are at the point where they're saying that effectively the Fire Staff got nerfed more than it got buffed in some ways. Also debatable, but we can see that the opinion is kind of shifting, and they're probably going to do another balance pass a month down the road after that to see how things change further, just step by step. On the Great Axe, they changed Execute so that the hitbox appears 2 frames later but lasts 2 additional frames. This is a bit strange to me. I guess in a way this slows down Execute a bit again. And why the longer lasting effect after? I guess I just don't want to cut the general duration, but want to give you some more time to avoid it. But then 2 frames also isn't exactly massive. So yeah, interesting change here. Along with that, however, to make up for that, I suppose, they're reducing the cooldown from 25 seconds to 20 seconds. So you just have more opportunity to try and hit that ability. Whirlwind moved up the block and dodge cancel window to be after the first spin instead of the second spin, so you can get out of it much easier. And the movement speed while active is increased by 15%. Also increased the rotation speed of Whirlwind by 20%, which I'm assuming will also mean that it hits quicker, because obviously you swing at enemies again quicker, and that could be quite interesting. They keep buffing Whirlwind in so many ways that it's technically a very appealing ability, but kind of suffers from the same thing as, I suppose, Cyclone the Spear, that it just doesn't have the same utility as many other abilities on the Great Axe, and is difficult to fit into a build when there are so many required abilities in many situations. But for the few bruisers that can get away without charge, for example, this is becoming more and more of an appealing option. The first hit damage of Reap is also increased from 60 to 80%. I'm not entirely sure if this was nerfed in the initial change to CC abilities, but yeah, just giving it a little bit more damage, especially in combination with the second hit also dealing a lot of damage. That's pretty nice. The first Greatsword change finally confirms that I wasn't crazy. Fixed an issue where Greatsword status effects could be incorrectly removed while traversing. Sometimes I would be wondering why I don't have an effect even right after using an ability, and I'm assuming that this is what causes this. In addition to that, Roaring Rupture has its Fortify increased from 8 to 10% per stack, and the duration increased from 5 to 7%. This is probably mainly because Fortify just isn't as effective as before anymore anyways, and that ability doesn't have that much utility compared to others, even though it still has a fair bit. This means it's now up to 30% Fortify. Skyward Slash, the Skyfall Sword upgrade specifically, has a reduced radius for the ground impact hitbox from 3 to 2 meters from the impact point. So this doesn't affect the tracking or anything, just the AoE itself. They also made some visual changes to also reflect that. The Hatchet gets a fix to a bug that I reported a long time ago, I think. Fixed an issue where players couldn't always transition between Hatchet social distancing and the aimed throw at the proper time. Now, if this is the change that I'm thinking of, then it's strange that it's only affecting social distancing here, because Rending Throw has the exact same problem, and I reported both. So I'm not quite sure what's going on. Maybe they just forgot to mention Rending Throw to the team writing the patch notes here, or I don't know what else could be going on with it. But yeah, I'm hoping that this is what I think it is, and it affects both, and we can just throw our hatchets again without having the issue of using light attacks in between if we throw them too quickly. The Infected Throw Aerial Transmission Cloud should now reflect the size better, the effect area of the disease in the weaken, and the damage is increased from 120% to 140%, so this is quite a heavy hitter now. The Rending Throw Rend is increased from 10 to 20%, which is very nice, especially when you keep in mind that the Rend duration is longer than the ability's cooldown. So this is a permanent 20% Rend if you use the ability effectively, even though it is mostly single target. Raging Torrent can now be block cancelled the same way it can already be dodge cancelled. Raging Torrent's target tracking was also not properly updating between attacks, and that should be fixed now. On a side note, they're finally saying tracking instead of homing, which is also nice. Social Distancing, which got its stagger removed a while ago, now has an unconditional root. You no longer need to be at a certain distance, you will always root with that attack. I like it because otherwise it's a relatively high skill or aim intense attack anyways, so that is fine with me. I think this sets up some nice combos on the Hatchet in general as well. You can kind of use it instead of Feral Rush in some ways through this, though obviously with Feral Rush you're able to CC the target longer. But generally I think a very nice change that requires the enemy to respond properly to being rooted in any situation and not just at a certain distance. The Ice Pylon on Ice Gauntlet will now be destroyed if an Ice Gauntlet is unequipped. This doesn't mean if you switch to your second weapon, just if you actually unequip the weapon entirely, because if it is inactive, the Ice Pylon will still persist. The ability getting a little rework here is Wind Chill. The grit is removed from the perk and instead put on the base ability. It will always have grit now. In addition to that, the damage of Wind Chill is increased from 20% to 24% weapon damage per tick. Given that they're doing relatively small changes to Wind Chill here in comparison, I have a feeling they already consider Wind Chill fairly strong and probably underrated and slept on, which happens sometimes. It used to happen with Flamethrower as well. Now the problem is that a lot of players are saying with Wind Chill, it's not so much about the damage output or the potential in that regard, even though that's also annoying because you can't light attack at the same time, obviously. The major issue for many of them is actually the usability of the ability itself. Keep in mind that the damage they're adding here is also further amplified by Chilling Blast, so we'll see what the outcome of this is, if this is actually just something they can brute force with raw damage. Enchanted Justice on the Life Staff now has a visual effect, so that AoE heal is actually visible. You can also no longer target dead players or players on Death Door. The reworked ability here is Splash of Light. The radius of the ability is reduced from 100 meters down to 25 meters, so the range is consistent with other life staff ability. But in return, the healing is increased from 60 to 80%. The Shared Recovery upgrade, which gives you 5% mana for every target that is healed below 50% health, is increased to 15% instead of 5% of your max mana. So the first thing this absolutely does is reducing stat padding, especially in wars, but also I feel like this is actually kind of a nerf. Sure, you are healing for a little bit more, but in a much smaller radius, so you need to be much closer to your group for this to be effective. I guess in PvE in particular, this will mostly be a buff, but in PvP situations, I think allies are often a bit further away than 25 meters, and that's where Splash of Light kinda comes in handy. I'm not a healing expert by any stretch of imagination, so maybe there's something I'm overlooking here, but to me it seems like this actually makes the ability worse quite a lot of the time. So I'm not quite sure where they're going with that one. That's probably the biggest question mark I have with this patch, but again, maybe I'm not seeing something here that healers know that makes this better than I think. And effectively, if your entire group is close to you, you are getting a total of 80% extra weapon damage as healing, so it's not bad in itself either. The musket is planned to get a full rework, so we are only seeing smaller changes for that at the moment and no specific ability changes, but they are making a very nice usability upgrade overall. First of all, they make the musket crosshair more visible during combat. We'll see what that looks like, but also they are changing power shot and powder burn to no longer require a dedicated reload. This also means that they can be used during other actions like shooter stance. A small trade-off is now the activation is not when the cooldown starts anymore, but the shot firing is when the cooldown starts. But this helps especially those who want to have a more close-range focused musket playstyle as well, because you don't stand there like a sitting duck changing over to your specific shot that you want to load into when you're not using something like stopping power. Requiring less tech to bypass certain reload animations and stuff and just focusing on shooting the musket when you want to with the effect that you want to, in my opinion, is much better for the overall usability of the weapon. I don't think it will solve the musket's current problems, but again, I think we have to wait for the bigger rework to really see the full effect of that. But these are just the weapon changes. Again, this patch is so absolutely massive that I cannot fit both the weapon changes and everything else in the same video. So we're gonna make a separate video where I talk about the other specific changes that will link right here so you can check it out for yourself and see what they've actually changed in the patch outside of what they've already announced in the update. If you want to see more about the new patch and also see me test things on PTR, consider subscribing, clicking the bell, and also maybe following me on Twitch TV/DukeSloth, where I will be streaming all of the new stuff once it comes out on PTR, and you can join in on the arenas, on the trials, on the raid boss if you want to. If you're interested in early trading tips, I post those on my Patreon, and I will have plenty for the next patch, I'm sure, so feel free to support me there. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that. Thanks for watching. DukeSloth out.